It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. These are some of the children who've died after exposure to harmful online content. Today, their parents call for much tougher action against tech companies.
How many children have got to die and vulnerable people have got to die for you to actually come down harsher?
The regulator Ofcom promises to act.
At the moment, teenagers, younger children, up and down the country can experience harmful content on their social media feeds again and again, and this has become normalised, and that has to change.
You swear that you will well and truly serve His Majesty King Charles in the office of First Minister of the Scottish Government.
His new First Minister is sworn in, but can he unite his party?
Did you ever think this day would be happening?
No, I didn't. It's, as I said to Parliament yesterday, really quite candidly, this is a big surprise for me.
And after disastrous local election results, will Rishi Sunak be feeling the heat at Prime Minister's questions? We'll have the action live at midday. Joining us today, Conservative MP Paul Bristow, Labour's Sarah Champion, SNP MP John Nicholson and political strategist Jo Tanner. This is Politics Live. Let's start with the story you heard at the top of the headlines there, and that's about more pressure being put on tech firms and asking them to take more responsibility in protecting children online. This is the BBC News headline. Tech firms face tougher online age checks, say Ofcom, the regulator. Just to give you an idea, a flavour of the sorts of measures that Ofcom says is going to make tech firms take on board, social media platforms must show they're removing illegal content. Some sites need to be age restricted and firms must reformulate algorithms to protect children, or one of the results could be hefty fines. The opening question to all of you, starting with you, Paul, is that going to be enough to protect children online?
Just this morning, my 9-year-old girl, my eldest girl, asked me if she could have her ears pierced. And inevitably, the next question that comes from her mouth is, can I have a phone, Daddy? And she wants to use social media, she wants to be an influencer, she wants to show off online to all of her friends.
At 9.
And I say no, because I don't want her exposed to the world of social media. I don't want her exposed to some of the bad things that happen on social media. Like John, I was very proud to serve on the Bill Committee for the Online Safety Bill. It's very proud that this government has passed that legislation, the first legislation of its type in the world, and we're doing it because we want to protect children. Now, Ofcom are the regulator. They've come forward with their proposals. Let's look at them. But that's why I'm proud to have served on that bill, because of my lived experience. Right,
but you are taking, one might say, quite a tough line with your own family. And we'll come on to this question about where the responsibility lies. But broadly, are those sorts of measures going to be enough to protect children from online harm in the way we saw those children at the beginning of the programme?
Sadly, no. I mean, it's a great step in the right direction, but the government could and should be doing much more. The reality is a quarter of 5 to 7-year-olds now have smartphones. What that means is they can open the door to the entire world, and there's a lot of bad people there. And what we need to be doing is trying to prevent that access at the start rather than dealing with the consequences of it.
Right. What do you think, John? Is this enough?
Well, I agree with my colleagues. It's a start. I don't think children that age should be given smartphones. We heard some incredibly moving testimony from the parents of children who'd committed suicide. So I've got some concerns about this, these new Ofcom guidelines. First of all, the age verification.
Yeah.
It's going to be
How will that work?
Well, that's the detail that we're not quite sure of, because it's very easy for children to bypass that, I would have thought. They could use false identities, they could use friends or older siblings. There's also the question of end-to-end encryption for DMs, which is another issue. Can it be restricted on the basis of age? But I've also got a concern about Ofcom. Ofcom is a very weak regulator. It has failed dismally over GB News, for example, and enforcing the rules on impartiality. They say they're going to take on a lot of extra staff. That's good. But will they enforce? Will they fine? The lessons from Germany are that if these companies are hit with big fines, they improve their behaviour. But Ofcom has got to show itself to be tough.
Right. Well, let's come back to the question of the regulator and whether it's got enough teeth with you, Paul. But first of all, Jo, just your first impressions about whether this is going to really transform the sort of social media platform landscape for children.
I think it's too early to say. I think anything that's done has got to be welcomed. But there is a contract between many people involved in this. There are parents. There are parents who stick their kids in front of a phone at a very young age because it helps when parenting, because it's stressful and they've got other things to be doing. So kids are getting used to and socialise with phones too young. Secondly, I'm guilty of it myself. I use my phone too much, probably around my son. And, you know, the sort of attachment to it that I almost demonstrate is not healthy, let alone what is seen. My son and I, he's 16 very soon, we have conversations about things he sees online. I take an interest in what he's looking at. But it would have been very easy for him to have had a phone at a younger age, to have had access to a phone at a younger age and probably faked his date of birth or something. There are
When did he get one?
I didn't give him, he had a brick phone, as he called it. He was very upset because it had no smart features on it because it was for an emergency purpose only when he was about 11 or 12. And it was only when he was in his later teens that I gave him something else. But it is I think to expect the regulator to do everything is not on. I think parents do have a role, but we have to start somewhere. So I think it's good that we're starting where we are, but it has to be monitored, it has to be watched, and we have to encourage people to talk more about what you're seeing. Not everything online is bad. You know, we do encourage children to explore the world by using tech, for example, through sort of research and things that they can do. It's not all bad, but it does need supervision.
But I think the reality is it's not about stopping children having a smartphone, because they'll find it through other routes. You know, if they have access to a computer, if they have a friend that's got it. I mean, what concerns me most is we still haven't got blanket relationship education at primary school level. You know, that's been in the law for, 5 years now? What we need to be doing is upstreaming this. So we need to be making children aware of what is and what isn't appropriate, what is respectful, what is harmful, so that they have some protection. And then we need to be going after the people that are actually creating this really sordid, destructive material. And of course, what we need to do is go for the platforms.
Right.
And I don't really blame Ofcom, because they've got the powers that they've been given and they've got the resources.
So how do you go after the platforms then?
Well, one of the things, I had a really interesting debate with some civil servants, and they said, I mean, remember the bill started in 2014.
It's taken a long time.
A long time. And also sort of technology's moved on very, very quickly. So what you ought to be doing, and what they should have included, was the iOS and the Android physical platforms that are hosting all of this, because if they put regulations around those, then everything else cascades down. It's not even in the scope of the bill. So what we're doing is retrospectively trying to catch up, but the genie is out there and it's rabid.
Right. I mean, in terms of what... I'm sorry, you wanted to say something in response to what you heard first, and I'll come on to Ofcom.
I was going to say, I agree with a lot of what Jo said. This is a contract between all sorts of people. We can't just rely on the government or Ofcom to do everything for us. But what it is there to do is to guide us. And this is the first piece of legislation in the world on this. And some of the things that we're talking about weren't a problem 2, 3, 5 years ago. It's iterative. It moves. Social media moves. The platforms move. And I do absolutely agree we need to be tougher on the platforms where these contents lie. But as I say, it's iterative. This is the first attempt to do anything like this in the world. So let's just see.
I don't know if you thought what I thought with the witnesses that we had from the social media companies. They were just astonishingly arrogant and dismissive. They were badly briefed often. They were disdainful. You could tell that they weren't really taking the threat particularly seriously.
So do you think they'll take these new measures seriously?
If we hit them with big fines, as Germany did, they will. But the other thing that was very striking was the number of people invigilating is remarkably small for Facebook, for example, in the English language. But the English language is the best invigilated of any language. If you're speaking some of the minority languages, I don't know, Albanian, for example, or Serbian, nobody is monitoring that at all. So it's a free-for-all for paedophiles in those countries to contact children with no restrictions placed on them at all, which is very disturbing. And as we all know, of course, the internet is international.
I think the other thing is I'm slightly obsessed with live streaming. that's going on around the world in the absolute poorest countries. And that's where someone in the UK sits in their living room and directs horrific abuse to children in the Philippines, for example. And I've been having a gentle argument with ministers because they don't think they've got reach to stop that. But Ofcom thinks under this new act that they have, because wherever in the world content is being generated, if it's being used by a UK person, they've got reach. So we also need ministers to realise that they have actually given these powers to Ofcom and to back them up when they go after these people. Yes. But we also need resources for the police to actually do the prosecutions.
I mean, just briefly, does Ofcom need more teeth in order to enforce these measures, to actually make a real difference?
Well, let's see what Ofcom do, and let's see how they use the powers that they've got. And I just don't want to repeat what I've said, but this is the first time in the world that any country has tried this. And so it is going to be a bit suck at it and see. And let's hope that it works. Let's hope it makes a difference. And where we lead, other countries will follow.
And it's important for journalists to follow what Ofcom is doing, because with a very weak administration at Ofcom that's reluctant to use the powers they already have, I think it's pressure from journalists focusing on this that will force the Ofcom leadership to keep their eye on this closely and to use the powers that they've got and to pursue this vigorously.
Let's talk about John Swinney, because you saw again in the headlines, and we can show you more pictures now, because he has been sworn in as the 7th First Minister in Scotland. There he is at the Court of Session in Edinburgh. He's expected to appoint his cabinet later on today. He was, of course, the former Deputy First Minister throughout Nicola Sturgeon's time in charge, and it follows the resignation of Humza Yousaf last week. John, that ended in disaster, didn't it? Humza Yousaf's sort of reign as First Minister.
Well, that's a bit melodramatic.
Well, but is it true?
No, a disaster. I wouldn't use the word for disaster.
He had to pull his partnership with the Greens.
Well, he didn't have to. He chose to do so. And, of course, he could have compromised with one of Alex Salmond's Alapa lot who's there, but he chose not to do so because he thought he would have to compromise his principles. I'm very sorry the way it ended. I think he was a gracious man. I think he took leadership in Gaza. I think we've got a reason to be proud. He's the first Muslim head of government of any Western democracy, which I think is something that Scotland should be proud of.
Sure.
John Swinney's a very good choice. He's a thoroughly nice man.
You don't sound that enamoured by it.
No, I'm very enamoured by him. I really like him. He's a very nice man. He's a very competent minister. He's a good and a kind person, and we need more goodness and kindness in politics.
How's he going to steady the ship when you list the sorts of issues that the SNP and the government in Scotland have had to deal with? I mentioned that they obviously ended. Humza Yousaf chose to end that partnership with the Greens, but obviously before that you had the resignation first of Nicola Sturgeon, the police inquiry into the party's finances, the arrest and subsequent charge of the former chief executive Peter Murrell, the resignation in February finally of Michael Matheson, the health secretary, after a row over an 11,000 mobile data.
From the Daily Express.
No, actually we've made our own list. We don't have to refer to anybody.
You've got the Daily Express in front of you.
No, that's a different headline. We'll come to that soon. Why, is any of that not the case?
Well, the Daily Express is a comic, of course, so I don't.
Well, never mind about that. But what about
reading anything from the Daily Express?
How is he going to steady the ship?
We all know the difficulties that the SNP has had. He's going to have to do what he said he would have to do yesterday, which is reach out to the other parties. The Scottish Parliament was set up, and people often forget this, it was set up to have minority governments. Once upon a time, people were worried they would always have a Labour government, how times change. And so it was set up so that the parties had to cooperate. That's the basis of democracy in Holyrood, and it's worked very well over the years. We've had Lib Dem, Labour coalitions, Green and SNP coalitions, and now we have a minority government that will have to stretch out.
So John Swinney has said we will return the SNP to governing from the mainstream. What does that mean? You weren't governing, clearly, in his mind, under the mainstream, under Humza Yousaf, then?
I think it means the bread and butter issues that people care about. So if you ask people what they care about, a lot of the extraneous issues that dominate press headlines, that the Daily Express, for example, is obsessed with, are not things that interest people particularly. The culture wars issues don't interest people. People are interested in the health service, they're interested in the economy, they're interested in poverty, they're interested in some of the good things the SNP's done on child poverty,
yeah, but it's interesting you haven't mentioned independence. I mean, I thought that was the sort of raison d'etre future of the SNP and the Greens too. Hasn't been mentioned by you in that, and nor by John Swinney. That's because it's not going anywhere.
Well, John Swinney did talk about independence. I heard him talking about independence. It goes without saying that independence is the raison d'etre of the SNP. But can I make the point that there's been a huge change certainly in my lifetime, on the Constitution. Steadily now, you have 50% or more than 50% in favour.
You're right.
The only group who opposes independence are the over 65s.
Well, let me just put that to you, because John is right. When it comes to independence, Labour's way ahead in the polls in Scotland, has been for quite some time. Well, it has been ahead. It has been ahead. It is ahead.
It's not way ahead.
All right, give me the figures.
The current polls show the SNP winning more seats than Labour. The Westminster elections, more seats than the Labour.
Yeah, but that's not to say. What do the polls say? What do the polls say in terms of support?
The polls showed that there's the Labour Party and the SNP are roughly neck and neck.
They're ahead.
Are you talking about the constituency, or are you talking about the single transferable vote?
Let's just accept that at the moment Labour has been ahead broadly in the polls. When it comes to independence, it's about 50-50.
I never thought I would say this, but the arguments John's using are the same that Rishi Sunak is using. And there's this delusional thought going on. And both of them have been in power for a very long time. I think they've forgotten that they're establishment. I think that John is absolutely right, that the public don't care about the culture wars that are being put forward, whether it's by the Tories or whether it's by the SNP. They want to know that they're going to have stability. They want to know that they're going to be able to afford to pay their bills at the end of the week. Yeah. And this just
so
feels
why
like...
is there still 50, broadly speaking, 50% support for independence?
It just feels like both these parties are now shuffling...
On that question,
shuffling
why is it that even if you are ahead in the polls, when it comes to the question of independence, the SNP or pro-independence parties still have 50% support?
I think for the same reason that a lot of people voted for Brexit. They are sick and tired of these central old school parties governing them when it doesn't have reality to their lives. So, well, I would love to have been in power for 14 years and put forward a different thing.
You're not a central mainstream party.
There is a huge difference between Brexit and independence.
Hang on, we'll come back to Brexit.
What I'm saying is, I think that people are frustrated with the same old, and all we're seeing from the Tories, all we're seeing from SNP is this shuffling the deck, backroom deals, coronations, just so that they can hang on to power. What they ought to be doing is listening to the people that need serve.
You did the same in Wales.
Let me talk to Paul, though, about independence, and in terms of the Conservatives not being ahead in the polls in Scotland. Why not? I mean, surely you would be able to capitalise on these... Oh, they're going to lose all their seats, are they?
I think so, yeah.
Well, there's the prediction. You heard it here first.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that's not going to be the case. But look, I wish John Swinney well. I hope he leads Scotland in a good way, has a constructive relationship with the UK government. But let's not forget, every single SNP Premier we've had has put independence front and centre, that ideology, and more recently gender ideology, above public services in Scotland. What's happened to the education system in Scotland is a tragedy. It was one of the best education systems in the Western world. It's fallen way below that in England, and that's because we've had independence and more recently gender ideology pushed ahead of public services.
These are Conservative central office talking points, and of course they're not true. Scotland has got the highest percentage of tertiary education in all of Europe. In all of Europe, in many regards, yes, it does.
But Scotland has fallen down the very rankings that Nicola Sturgeon used to shout about endlessly.
In some subjects,
but quite seriously, they have come down.
But in terms of policies that the SNP has pursued, the Labour Party has done U-turns on many social progressive policies that the SNP champions. Scottish child payments, for example, have been transformative in reversing poverty in Scotland. Scotland accident and emergency rates are the best in the United Kingdom. There are lots of good things going on in Scotland that the public like and support.
Let me just bring Jo in, and then I'm going to come back to the issue of the Gender Recognition Reform Act with our other guests. But Jo, just watching this from the outside, John Swinney, now the 7th First Minister, how does it look to you in terms of what's been going on in Scotland?
I think there's a perspective from London or from Westminster that's very different to perhaps how it's being felt in Scotland itself. I do think one of the interesting points is that you've got a situation now where the Conservatives have passed power between individuals and the SNP have done the same. And you do have to wonder, when Labour's message is all about change, you can see how that will actually appeal to people that are just a bit fed up with the establishment feeling like it can just hand over the reins to the next person and not actually go back and consult the public. And I do think that that sort of fatigue with politics and fatigue with politicians is going to be really interesting to see if it plays out as strongly in Scotland as well as it potentially will play out in the rest of the UK.
But we have a parliamentary system. We don't elect presidents in the United Kingdom. So you elect governments and you elect parties. And in the case of Scotland, you have a fixed term Parliament.
Sure.
Now, Sarah talked about transferring power from one First Minister to the other and smiled enigmatically when I reminded her that's exactly what the Labour Party did in Wales.
Yeah, but does that make it right? I mean, people might be asking in Scotland, what is the direction of the party? You have but you have passed the power.
Is not independence being shouted as it was before. It will feel like a change in direction, so it's a risk.
And what is that? You talked about progressive politics.
Yeah.
Is the SNP under John Swinney going to still pursue the sorts of policies that we saw under Humza Yousaf, or is he going to move in a more conservative direction for the party? He wants to welcome Kate Forbes, perhaps in a senior position in the government. Do you welcome that?
Yes, she was a very talented minister. She was the Minister for the Economy before. She's an excellent communicator. I would love to see her back. You know what my politics are, we talked about...
But she was the person who also said she wouldn't have voted in favour of same-sex marriage if she had had that opportunity. And it caused a huge controversy amongst SNP supporters and activists, and for you too.
Well, obviously, I deeply disagree.
Yes.
Deeply disagree with that.
But you're happy for her to be at the centre of the new SNP government?
Inevitably, parties are broad churches. But on the Gender Recognition Act, Paul mentioned, you remember, of course, that Theresa May supported this, and it was also a manifesto commitment.
So are you upset that the legal action has now been dropped by the government?
I think the government's got to listen to lawyers and decide whether or not it's pursuing a fruitless case or not. But I certainly think at the time of the independence referendum, we were told that we would be the most powerful devolved parliament in the world. I think Holyrood has the right to legislate in areas of its competence without Westminster interfering, which I think is entirely improper.
Well, you mentioned Theresa May supporting much of the gender recognition reform bill. Labour did too in Scotland.
Yes.
Anas Sarwar was quite a prominent supporter of it, and he's the leader of Labour in Scotland, but he changed his mind. Why is that?
I think the thing that he was most concerned about was the age 16. And I think he was right to have some concerns over that. But people can change their minds.
I think he was most concerned about Keir Starmer phoning him up and telling him what to do, which is how he tends to make policies these days. What do you want me to do, Keir? OK, it'll be done. He's no leader, I'm afraid.
Right, but Westminster did block it successfully in the courts, and actually, and you think that was quite right, but actually the SNP have decided not to continue with their illegal action. Should they?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, and I would listen to what the legal advice is. So if the legal advice is that it will not be successful, a challenge, then obviously I would listen to the lawyers. And if that's what the lawyers say, fair enough, you have to do what the lawyers say and make the arguments in different ways. It was a progressive piece of legislation. It enjoyed wide popularity. It was a manifesto commitment, and it should have proceeded. Similar legislation has been enacted all across Northern Europe without any of the horrors that some of the tabloids predicted. Ireland, for example, has it.
All right, well, did you support it broadly?
I did support it broadly. I did also question bringing in self-certification for 16-year-olds when all of the other ages of consent are around this are at 18. So I share the concerns about that. What I find, though, is with this debate, it's very, very rarely about the trans community, and I very rarely hear the trans voices. What I see is a lot of positioning, a lot of politics, and a lot of really unpleasant, hateful comment around it.
Well, and some of that's stoked by Conservatives.
It's about protecting single-sex spaces. It's about protecting vulnerable women and girls. It's not putting someone who's a convicted rapist in a woman's prison who's clearly a man. Look, this
it's a matter for the prison governor.
What Scotland should be, I mean, it's far for me to advise the Scottish Government or the SNP, and they wouldn't take my advice anyway, but my suggestion would be to focus on fixing the education system, focus on fixing the National Health Service, focus on those day-to-day issues that interest people in Scotland. This Gender Recognition Act has brought down a government and may have brought down a second First Minister. It's ridiculous.
Well, and on that, the Hilary Cass review, which looked at child gender care services, calling for more research on things like puberty blockers, which have now been halted in Scotland. Should John Swinney and the government accept her recommendations in full?
Well, I think a lot of her recommendations were caricatured, and I think she herself was a bit disturbed by the way that some people
but should they be accepted?
Well, there were some things about it that I certainly welcome. I think that when trans people present themselves at the GP often transferred them without having a holistic overall approach to their mental health and other issues. There was aspects of it that I strongly supported, but I think it's a matter for clinicians, not for politicians. And I completely agree with what Sarah said, that there's been a lack of kindness has characterised much of this debate. And too often we talk about trans people without listening to trans people and their lived life experiences.
Well, Jo, let me just show you this tweet from Lee Rowley, who's a housing minister. We're announcing changes to building regulations to ensure single-sex toilets are provided in public buildings in the future. I never expected to have to spell out basic, time-honoured realities such as this in regulation. Sadly, activists are necessitating it. What did you make of this provision for single-sex toilets alongside a gender-neutral one?
I find the whole thing quite worrying in that I think Sarah's point is quite right in that the debate has become so polarised and aggressive, actually, in many cases, that I worry about bad policy being created off the back of it, because I think it becomes about bullying politicians, I think it becomes about aggressive commentary in the media, and I'm never convinced that that then actually acts in the interests of all of the parties that need to have representation. That's exactly what people in politics are there to do. They are to represent all of the voices.
It also stops debate immediately.
Exactly.
If I put anything out about it on Twitter, the monstering I get, you just back away, and that's not good for our
And as
democracy.
a woman, if I now say I don't really have an opinion on it, I'll probably get abuse from other women for the fact that I'm not standing up for them. But I just get very concerned that there are lots of people that have opinions on this, not always well informed. There are many people that just jump into the debate because they think it's something to jump into, but it isn't necessarily founded on proper information and probably proper discussions, because there are parts of the communities that are unable to speak.
Have Conservative government fuelled this?
Well, of course not. But what tends to happen is, Jo, is you'll have restaurants, hospitality business, swimming pools, all sorts of other people who are completely and utterly cascaded on social media. They are sometimes boycotted against because they won't provide the sorts of services, if you like, that certain extremists and zealots want. What's happened to common sense in this country? Of course we need spaces where men and women, single-sex safe spaces where they can go to the toilet, be that intimate process of going to the toilet on their own.
We're about to talk about the Conservative vision. Were these necessary?
You could go to a busy concert and see a huge queue outside a men's toilet, outside a women's toilet, and a bunch of women will volunteer to go into the men's.
But that's their individual choice.
It is their individual choice. But my point is that...
But the fact that we're having to legislate for this shows how toxic and
ridiculous
this debate has become.
One at a time.
It's no common sense in this.
But you don't have to legislate for it. We already have planning legislation. The Equalities and Human Rights Commission has got very clear guidance on this.
Clearly we do.
So,
if you see some of the toxic way that these businesses are trolled on social media,
so why it's coming up
we
again
have to do it.
is because we're looking at this whole...
Politicians don't have a degree of common sense on this issue.
Let Sarah respond.
Gender Recognition Act in Scotland. The whole thing's absurd.
Could I possibly speak? What we're looking at, again, is this becoming weaponised and we're looking at Tory potential leaders trying to make points of difference to themselves.
Ridiculous.
They are getting the airtime. You know, when I go on a plane it's a toilet. If it's a single-use toilet, then just make it a toilet. And then, yes, I completely agree. I was actually at a classic car racing on Sunday, and it was a delight that I could walk into women's toilets and there weren't massive queues. But like you, Jo, when there's a massive queue in the women's, if it is a single-use toilet in the men's, I will go in there. I have no issues with it.
I think we're becoming a laughingstock. I mean, we've just had a 5-minute conversation about what they call in Scotland kludgies.
But you've brought us here.
They are people abroad.
You brought us here.
People abroad.
Yeah, well, answer that. I mean, Paul is saying the SNP, have brought us to this stage in the same way that I'm saying that perhaps Paul and the Conservatives have.
I don't know if you've been on a train recently, Jo, but
every day.
Well, but they have shared lavatories. They've shared lavatories all across the country. We've had it for decades. Nobody's thought about it until people like Kemi Badenoch started bawling about toilets.
John, I'm the father of 2 girls. I know my wife, when she's going to the toilet with my girls, wants to be in a single-sex space. And that does not make her transphobic, doesn't make her in any way excluded from this debate. To turn around and insist, or turn around and say that we need shared toilets in every situation is ridiculous. Let businesses and hospitality do what their patrons expect. Single-sex spaces.
What happens to a dad that wants to take his daughter to the toilet?
Well, I go to a disabled toilet when I do it, and it's quite simple. It's quite simple. But to sit there,
but how does that work?
And quite often, you should see sometimes the actual strange looks I get when I do this.
My mum's disabled. If she needs to use the toilet, and she'll need to use it quite quickly because of her disability, and she's waiting for a dad to be taking his daughter to the toilet.
Well, of course I will wait.
When he could use something.
Of course I will wait.
But you wouldn't know if they arrived outside.
Of course I will wait for that.
We are causing more problems.
Of course I will wait for that person with disabilities to go first. Of course that's the situation. And do you know something? I think people who run hospitality businesses, who work in hospitality businesses, have a degree of common sense. And they can sort these issues out for themselves. And they can have single-sex spaces. We don't need legislation like this. The fact that we're having to have it shows how ridiculous these politicians
I think we've exhausted the discussion.
Thank you.
On toilets. Let's move to the chamber inside the House of Commons. Just show you the shot there. MPs will be gathering because we have Prime Minister's questions in the next 15 minutes. And, of course, it'll be the first PMQs for Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, since the local election results and the fallout for him from that drubbing, which saw the Conservatives lose nearly 500 seats. So I suppose the big question will be, will the opposition in front of him be matched by opposition behind? Because former Cabinet Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg was on his GB News show last night saying this about what he needs to do.
Last week's election results were a thumping defeat for the Tories and a warning of what is likely to follow at a general election. Although Labour under Keir Starmer is not as popular as New Labour under Blair, the electorate is wary of a Conservative Party that has no vision. All they seem to offer is an arguably competent management of the status quo.
Well, that was Jacob Rees-Mogg. Another Tory MP and former Minister Paul Scully was sat here yesterday and said on the programme that the Conservatives need to build a vision, otherwise Labour's going to win the election. Do you agree with both their assessments of what's going to happen?
I don't think anyone would disagree that the Conservative Party need to set out a vision of what we're going to do should we form the government after the next election.
Do you think you're going to lose?
No one disagrees. Well, of course, we've got to... I don't think I will lose. I think I will retain my seat. I was one of the few Conservative MPs where the popular vote in my constituency, I got more votes, or the Conservatives got more votes than the Labour. We did lose councillors. You have to be humble in that and understand and have a sense of humility. But my popular vote in my constituency, I think, bodes well for the general election. We've got to go out there and we've got to convince people. But part of that, like Jacob and like Paul Scully were saying, we need to offer a vision about what we will do should we form the next government.
Right, the vision. And what is that vision in your mind?
Well, we're having conversations at the moment about what that manifesto should be, but I would hope that would be on the side of hard-working people. I want to continue...
Well, everyone wants to be on the side of hard-working people.
I want to continue the tax cuts that we are putting forward. I think they are popular. That's the right way to go. So sound economy, tax cuts, more money in people's pockets. I want us to continue reducing the NHS waiting lists. I want to see us... We're the only party who've got a plan to halt illegal immigration. The Labour Party's policy at the moment is, well, they don't have one at the moment. It's very much for open borders. And I think we need to go out there and we need to offer that vision to the British people.
Right. What do you say to that as a former strategist for Boris Johnson, who was very successful electorally in London before he became Prime Minister? Do you know what the Conservative vision is for the party, apart from more of the same?
No, I don't, and I don't think the party does either. I mean, they've all got different views on what they should all be doing. I mean, it's being played out on a daily basis from individual MPs who are sort of calling for this or calling for that, and they're having an identity crisis about whether to worry about reform and attract the right, or whether actually to take the fight to the centre ground. And if you put a bunch of Conservative MPs in a room, they will all give you a different view. Well, they're not necessarily. They'll unite behind certain issues, but there's so many. I mean, so many of us watched the leadership election and said the party is pretty much ungovernable. Ever since the genie was out of the bottle with Brexit, what we haven't had is the discipline and the sort of united front that they used to be able to do quite well. And they've always been a broad church. They always use that phrase, you know, it's talked about with political parties. Yeah. But most political parties can manage that. But when they don't feel they can unite around a vision, you've had two very specific parts of the party, in Paul and in Jacob, saying the same thing in slightly different ways. But you can tell that they don't feel that they're being represented by a vision right now.
What's your advice then?
Well, I think it's interesting that they're having a meeting in Downing Street with the very people that were in charge of the sort of approach that's just failed. I mean, I think they do need to have a broader conversation with themselves. I do think it was disappointing that they were still too bullish, I think, when the results were coming in. I think they were still too convinced that it's all about the plan and whether the plan's working, and, you know, almost the public don't recognise the plan's working for them. They should know better. I don't think that works. I think they need to genuinely recognise there were things that they were elected to do under Boris Johnson, which was delivering Brexit. There are plenty of other things they should have been doing. They haven't managed to get to all of those. They need to be a little bit broader and a bit smarter on this whole the damage that COVID and Ukraine war has caused. But they also need to demonstrate that they do understand what matters to people. And on a daily basis, it's not just about what they say at the election. On a daily basis, there are policies coming out that probably 80% of the public don't even really identify with or care about.
Right, well, to take on that theme, Paul, I mean, there is a lot of advice. You've got Michael Gove reportedly telling the Cabinet yesterday that the party should avoid pursuing hardline policies and instead focus on broad appeal. We had Damien Green, head of the One Nation Conservatives, saying don't, or a lurch to the right would be irrational. You've got Robert Jenrick, who many see is putting forward his leadership campaign, former immigration minister, saying there should be a legal migration cap of tens of thousands. Who's right?
Well, all this kind of lurching to the right, to the left, I mean, this is just nonsense.
Well, this is Michael Gove. This isn't me.
It's nonsense. I think all Conservatives would agree with the low tax strategy we've put forward. All Conservatives would agree that we need to control our borders.
Right. On the taxation, though, Paul, viewers will be sitting there thinking, but you've presided over the highest levels of taxation. Yes, you've made some cuts to national insurance, but overall, you have presided over the highest levels of taxation with freezing those tax thresholds. So what is it that's got to change?
Well, it's the biggest tax cut in a generation. I don't think you can just dismiss it like that. It's £900 back in the pocket of hard-working people in this country.
But what did they do at the local elections? It was a big thumbs down, wasn't it? Right across the country pretty well.
Well, the local elections, I think, were closer than a lot of people expected them to be. I think if you look at where Tony Blair was, and everyone's predicting a similar 97-style majority, we're not there. I think it still shows there's a lot in the game still. And I think people are taking a closer look at the Labour Party. And just remember, Keir Starmer is no Tony Blair.
Well, we're going to come on to Keir Starmer and Labour in just a moment. But before we go and talk to my colleague Vicki Young, do you think you are facing a thumping defeat at the general election?
No.
Do you think you're going to win?
Well, look, I mean, Sarah may laugh arrogantly
I'm not arrogant.
next to me. I think that she's on for
Could you stop projecting your aggression onto me?
Thumping majority. All I will say is, if you do that, I think you risk making a fool of yourself, because I think the election will be a lot closer than people.
But you'll still lose.
I'm not saying that at all. I'm confident we can go on.
Every Tory will tell you that they're going to lose privately when they talk about it. But where I think Paul's correct is that it's very different from 97. I remember 97. There was a great deal of enthusiasm for Tony Blair and the Labour Party. This time round, I think a lot of Labour's strength, such as it is an anti-Tory vote rather than an enthusiasm for what Labour stands for, because a lot of people really don't know what Labour stands for.
Well, let me just briefly then get you to respond to that, but we'll come back to it. On the sealing the deal, as we call it, Keir Starmer hasn't quite done that.
I think he has. I think he's coming across as the grown-up in the room. And I'm sorry, I wasn't here being arrogant. I'm embarrassed embarrassed. I'm embarrassed that my government...
You don't need to be embarrassed.
Thank you. I'm embarrassed that my government has no vision now and that you're talking about getting one. I want it now. You know, my constituents are suffering now. They don't want to... I mean, it was just delusional, Rishi Sunak. I mean, he must have been punch drunk coming out and trying to sort of spin it as a victory. I mean, don't tell me you're going to listen. Tell me how you're going to solve the problems you've created. I just want stability.
All right, well, let's talk to Vicki Young, the BBC's Deputy Political Editor, about the challenge for Rishi Sunak. Hello to you, Vicki. PMQs coming up in just over 5 minutes' time. It's not going to be easy, you would think, for Rishi Sunak after those local election results. But, of course, is there as much opposition from behind him as there is in front?
Yeah, I mean, look, the problem he's got is that those were a terrible set of results. There's no getting away from that. Now, he is trying to say that it's not a foregone conclusion, the general election. I mean, that is true in the sense that not a vote has been cast. So you can look on the positive side. But if you speak to Tory MPs privately, it's very hard to find any who think that the party is actually going to win. Now, we know that those critics who had talked about trying to get rid of the Prime Minister, they're not going to do that. So his position is safe, but that doesn't mean that the criticism is going to stop. And I think we've seen that today, haven't we? Robert Jenrick, we've had Suella Braverman at the weekend. They're positioning around him. So he's there safe in the middle, but around him, they are basically planning for a general election defeat and for who is going to take over. So they've got to get through this. I think there will be some support for him. And Tory MPs, don't forget, are then trooping off to Downing Street to have a presentation about how those local elections went. They're talking about it being closer than everyone thinks, but you know there isn't much credible evidence for that from these results. And there's plenty of Tory MPs looking at the local election results, looking at the mayoral results, and looking at their own patch and being pretty fearful about what is ahead for them.
Vicki Young, thank you very much. And, of course, Vicki will be joining us here in the studio after Prime Minister's questions. Well, let's talk about... Oh, you want to... Yes, respond,
I just wanted to respond to this.
Yeah.
I'm a backbench Conservative MP who was sacked from being albeit a very junior government role for taking a different stance on Gaza. I was a staunch supporter of Boris Johnson to the bitter end, and again when Boris Johnson stood in the second leadership contest. I'm perhaps not naturally considered to be a Rishi supporter in all those times.
But you don't want him to go?
Of course not. I'm 100% behind the Prime Minister. I think he's by far the best candidate to lead the country as Prime Minister.
Not saying much,
I think he can go on and win the next general election. The results in my constituency, the Conservatives were ahead, Sarah. So we can go on in my marginal constituency win. If we can win in my marginal constituency, we can go on elsewhere.
All right, well, let's talk about Labour, because there was something of a challenge in these local elections and the local election results on what we might call the left flank of the Labour Party, and particularly from the Greens. Let me just show you this headline in the Eye. Inside Labour's plan to stop the Green surge. Labour draws up dossier naming and shaming Green Party efforts to block environmental projects. Is this a good strategy, Sarah?
I think you need to be realistic that local elections are fought on a very different sort of book than going into a general. So in my constituency, we had 2 independents who were on the Gaza ticket. But then you have to say, well, what influence are they going to have on government as an independent councillor? We also had some independents that got in around planning issues. So I think that, of course, you need to look at and learn from what's happened in the locals, but it's a very different playbook when we get into the generals.
But does that mean you are actually going to take on some of these concerns? I mean, you mentioned the Israel-Gaza conflict.
Absolutely.
There were a series of councillors who'd already quit the Labour Party to stand as independents, and many of them won, and Oldham was lost to Labour as a result because they didn't like the stance that Labour and Keir Starmer took early on.
Yeah, and I understand that, and I also understand why there's a green surge, because there's, you know, climate change has to be...
Because you dropped your £28 billion investment plan, or diluted it heavily.
I think the language is that we are going to roll it out over a longer timescale rather than drop it. But unless we are very robust in tackling climate change, then we're going to have problems. So you see these sort of surges coming in, and what Labour needs to do is get the good ones, incorporate the good ones and take them forward, because there are lots of topics that we need to be addressing as a party, and more strongly than we are.
The Labour leadership over Gaza was chaotic, and their judgment was badly skewed. Now, I notice they're trying to gaslight us a little bit at the moment and pretend that they were always actually in favour of an immediate ceasefire.
Which is what their current position is.
Which is what their new position is. But if you remember, when the SNP introduced a ceasefire motion way back in November, and then again subsequently, Sarah was one of 56 brave Labour MPs who decided that they would vote with their conscience, despite a fair degree of bullying by the party leadership, and those who voted with their conscience were sacked. I wonder if Keir Starmer and the Labour leadership have apologised to some of these Labour MPs for the pressure they put them under to follow their conscience and do the right thing.
Well, it's an SNP characterisation, and the problem is we shouldn't be making party politics over something as horrific as what's going on.
Which is what you're saying the SNP were doing.
Okay, that's touche.
Well, and that was
I'm really not. I admired Sarah for being brave, as the others did, and for resisting the pressure. Sarah and I met and became friends when we travelled to Palestine together when we were both first elected. So, no, it's not a party politics thing at all.
But that is how the motion at the time, the SNP, was viewed by the Labour Party. Let's not go over that.
I think Parliament should be united on this human rights issue.
All right, but I mean, again, this was also an issue in your area, wasn't it, over Israel-Gaza?
Well, Gaza, what's going on in Gaza is not just a blip around a local issue. This is one of the major international issues of our time. This is not a faraway conflict, to coin a phrase, for people of which we know nothing. This is an everyday experience. The attacks on the 7th of October affected many Jewish communities in this country. And somewhere like Peterborough, it's not just an issue because you're concerned about human rights. I've got people from Gaza living in my constituency, and when they come to tell me about their families being killed, about their homes being destroyed, if there's one thing that keeps me up at night as a Member of Parliament, it's speaking to those people and hearing those stories. And that's why I called for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, and I will continue to do so as long as I'm a Member of Parliament.
And PMQs is coming up in just a moment. But on that, do you think the government needs to change its approach then in terms of what it says about that conflict?
Well, I'm much more pleased with the stance and the approach we've taken of late, as we were in the past, but I want to see our government press for a permanent ceasefire.
PMQs has started.
Mr Speaker, I know the whole House will join me in congratulating John Swinney on becoming SNP leader and Scottish First Minister. I look forward to working constructively with him to deliver for the people of Scotland. Mr Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Kirsty Dawson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. At last week's Prime Minister's questions, I highlighted the shocking rise in the number of teenagers trying vaping, and I asked the Prime Minister if he would take decisive action to stop vape advertising on football strips. He declined to do that. Since then, I have had an exchange with the Scottish Chief Medical Officer, Professor Sir Gregor Smith, during a session of the Tobacco and Vapes Bill Committee. And he said, "Where I become very uncomfortable and I am not supportive is where the massive attraction of sports companies is used in a way that promotes behaviours that are known to be unsafe or unhealthy." Can I ask the Prime Minister again, does he still think that it is right that vape companies should sponsor football kits?
Mr Speaker, I'm glad the Honourable Lady agrees with me and the Government that we should do more to tackle youth vaping, and that's why we are bringing forward measures in the new bill to restrict the availability and appeal of vapes to children specifically, whether that's flavours or indeed marketing. As she knows, advertising of vapes is already heavily restricted by UK regulations, including a ban on advertising on television and radio and most online. Now, we've seen football take positive voluntary action in the past on issues such as this, but I will say to her that the Government will respond to the Honourable Lady's specific amendment in the usual way.
Cheryl Merritt.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Officer in the Armed Forces. In recent weeks, Mr Speaker, my right honourable friend has announced plans to control welfare and get people back to work, to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, and pass legislation to get flights off to Rwanda. Does he agree with me that these are all issues that real people like my constituents in South East Cornwall care about, and that the Leader of the Opposition should do the right thing and back them.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is a fantastic champion for her local area. And can I also thank her daughter for her service in the armed forces? And she's right, I'm not surprised that the Labour Party don't back our plans to stop the boats. I'm not surprised they don't back our plans to get people into work and reform welfare. But I do think that they should do the right thing when it comes to the security of our nation, and that's back our plans to increase defence spending and give our brave armed forces personnel the resources they need to keep us safe.
We now come to Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, can I warmly welcome the new member for Blackpool South? After the representation that fine town has had recently, it's good to know they've got a proper champion back at last. Can I also warmly welcome the new Labour MP for Dover to these benches? Mr. Speaker, if 1 week a Tory MP who's also a doctor says the Prime Minister can't be trusted with the NHS and joins Labour, and the next week the Tory MP for Dover, on the front line of the small boats crisis, says the Prime Minister cannot be trusted with our borders and joins Labour, what is the point of this failed government staggering on?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I actually join him in welcoming his newest MP for Blackpool? I must say he looks a lot happier than the member who was sitting there last week. But let me also join with him, and let me join with him in congratulating all new and paying tribute to all former councillors, PCCs and mayors across the country. I hope his new ones do him as proud as I am of all of mine, Mr. Speaker. Great leaders like Andy Street, who leave behind a strong legacy of more homes, more jobs and more investment, in sharp contrast to the legacy left by the last Labour government, which was a letter joking that there was no money left.
Well, Mr. Speaker, in addition to losing 2 Tory MPs in 2 weeks, the Prime Minister's been on the receiving end of some of the biggest by-election swings in history. He's also lost 1,500 Tory councillors, half of his party's mayors, and a leadership election to a lettuce. How many more times do the public and his own MPs need to reject him before he takes the hint?
Well, Mr. Speaker, this time last year I reminded him of some advice, actually, from his own mentor, Tony Blair, who had said at the time that he can be as cocky as he likes about local elections, but come a general election, it's policy that counts, Mr. Speaker. Now, one year on from that advice, what has he managed? £28 billion of tax rises, 70 new business regulations, 30 U-turns, and a deputy leader under a police investigation.
Well, I'm surprised he brought up a police investigation. I think his record is played 1, no, actually 2, the seatbelt as well. Played 2, lost 2 in relation to police investigations. But it's the same. The public keep telling him, the voters tell him it's not good enough. Instead of listening, he keeps telling them everything's fine if only they'd realise his greatness. He just doesn't get it. But at least after Thursday night, Mr. Speaker, he can go to the many places that he calls home and enjoy the fruits of his success. In Southampton or Downing Street, he's got great Labour councils. At his mansion in Richmond, he can enjoy a brand new Labour mayor of North Yorkshire. And at his pad in Kensington, he can celebrate a historic 3rd term for the Mayor of London. Now that he too can enjoy the benefits of this changed Labour Party, is he really still in such a hurry to get back to California?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I must say I was of course surprised to see the honourable gentleman in North Yorkshire, but probably not as surprised as he was when he realised he couldn't take the tube there, Mr. Speaker. But I can tell him that the people of North Yorkshire believe in hard work, secure borders, lower taxes and straight-talking common sense, Mr. Speaker. They're not going to get any of that from a virtue-signalling lawyer from North London.
Well, It was great to be in Northallerton, where they just voted to reject the Prime Minister's proposition. Mr. Speaker, he's finally found something in common with the British public. No matter where he calls home, all his neighbours are backing this Change Labour Party. And they keep rejecting him because they have sussed him out. They know there's nothing behind the boasts, the gimmicks, the smug smile. He's a dodgy salesman, desperate to sell them a dud. Now, Mr. Speaker, 16 days ago, when he held a press conference claiming victory on Rwanda, he said the next few weeks will be about action. People want deeds, not words. So let's test that. How many small boat crossings have there been since he said that 16 days ago?
Mr. Speaker, actually, just before we go on to that, he talked about a change. He talked about a changed Labour Party. That's important because he talked about a changed Labour Party. He talks about it a lot. But just this morning, and he also talked about his new mayor in London. So just this morning, we've learned that the Labour mayor in London believes, and I quote, that there is an equivalence between the brutal terrorist attack of Hamas and Israel defending itself. And let me be crystal clear. There is absolutely no equivalence between a terrorist group and a democratic state. So can I ask him now, will he take this opportunity to demonstrate that that Labour Party has changed? And will he condemn those comments from the Labour mayor?
Well, I know that was the last run out before the general election, but he's getting ahead of himself in asking me questions. But Mr. Speaker, I notice he didn't even attempt to answer the question. He knows the answer. Since he claimed victory 16 days ago, there have been a staggering 2,400 small boat crossings. 2,400! That's a gimmick, not a deterrent. And those 2,400 will be added to the Tories' asylum perma-backlog, which is forecast to rise to 100,000 by the end of this year. Now, the Prime Minister pretends he will remove them all to Rwanda, but Rwanda can only take a few hundred a year. At that rate, the Prime Minister's grand plan would take over 300 years to remove them all. Mr. Speaker, that's tens of thousands of people with their claims going unprocessed, who are going to be here for their entire lifetime living in hotels at the taxpayers' expense. It is absurd to call that anything other than an amnesty handed to them by the Tory party, isn't it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, he had the opportunity to condemn the comments of his mayor, a mayor who said that there is an equivalence between Hamas and Israel. He did not do that, and everyone will see what that is. That is the Change Labour Party, Mr. Speaker, right there. But since I became Prime Minister, small boat crossings are down by a third. That's because we've doubled NCA funding, increased enforcement rates, closed bank accounts, deported 24,000 people, processed more claims, and, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to border control, there is a crucial difference between us. We want secure borders. He's happy with open borders.
Mr. Speaker, the whole country knows that removing less than 1% of asylum seekers isn't stopping the boats, it's granting an amnesty, a Tory amnesty. But if he thinks the voters are wrong, if he thinks his own MPs joining the Labour Party are wrong, if he thinks anyone believes any of the nonsense that he spouts, why doesn't he put it to the test and call a general election?
Mr. Speaker, he talks about removing people. This is a person who campaigned to stop the deportation of foreign national offenders, Mr. Speaker. It shows how out of touch his values are with the British people. But, Mr. Speaker, it's yet another week where we hear nothing about his plan to do anything on the issues that matter to the country. Meanwhile, we're getting on, reforming welfare and getting people into work. He opposes it. We're controlling migration, legal and illegal. He opposes it. And as we heard, Mr. Speaker, we are boosting defence spending to strengthen our country. He opposes it, and that's the difference. He snipes from the sidelines. The Conservatives are building a brighter future.
When it comes to small boat crossings, there's a lot of talk of human rights. But surely the only human right and life that matters is the life of children who are being taken across the Channel. In this respect, will the government now do the only thing that will actually be a real deterrence, and that is to arrest and detain all those who land illegally on our shores and then offshore them promptly, so that once and for all we can save lives and end this cruel and callous trade?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend is right that these crossings are incredibly dangerous and they risk people's lives. Just weeks ago, a 7-year-old girl died attempting the crossing, and that's why, as a matter of basic compassion, we must do everything we can to break the cycle of the criminal gangs. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, you need a deterrent. That's what the National Crime Agency say. That's how we dealt with illegal migrants from Albania, because it's only by removing people who shouldn't be here that we remove the reason for them to come in the first place. And that is how we'll control our borders. And it's clear that it's only this party that not only has a plan to stop the boats, but has a plan to stop the tragic loss of life in the Channel too.
SNP leader Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I begin by also congratulating the fantastic John Swinney on becoming Scotland's first minister. Our opponents should be careful, very careful what they wish for. Mr. Speaker, as we await the imminent Israeli incursion into Rafah, where 1.2 million people are sheltering, including 600,000 children, it has been reported that the United States has paused an arms shipment to Israel. The UK will now follow suit, won't it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman may not realise, but the UK government doesn't itself directly provide arms or ship arms to Israel. And when it comes to the situation in Rafah, I've been very clear that we are deeply concerned about a full military incursion of Rafah, given the devastating humanitarian impact. I've made that position and point specifically to Prime Minister Netanyahu whenever we've spoken, and will continue to urge all sides to focus on the negotiations at hand to bring about a pause in the conflict, to release hostages and get more aid in.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, let's be clear. The confidence that Israel has shown in its military ambitions in Rafah stems from the silence which has been shown from its allies on the front benches in this place and indeed elsewhere across the world. Now, we all know that UK arms and tech is supporting Israel's activities in Gaza and will be used in any attack on Rafah. Knowing that and the devastation which is going to occur, surely the time has come to end our complicity and to halt arms sales to Israel.
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course we take our defence export responsibilities extremely seriously, and that's why we operate one of the most robust licensing control regimes anywhere in the world. We periodically review advice on Israel's commitment to international humanitarian law, and ministers always act in accordance with that advice. And that is crystal clear for the House to understand. Our position with regard to export licences following the most recent assessment is unchanged, and I know that he will join me in urging all parties to engage in the negotiations that are happening so we can see a pause in fighting, to get more aid in, hostages out, and then bring about a sustainable ceasefire to this conflict.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents in rural villages and on the fringes of the Grimsby-Cleethorpes urban area are very concerned about overdevelopment. They recognise that the highway infrastructure and public services are already overloaded. Could my right honourable friend consider amending planning guidance so that local plans and decisions taken by local planning authorities are not overridden by planning inspectors? And they'd be greatly encouraged if he would agree to meet with me and my colleagues from the neighbouring Gainsborough and Grimsby constituencies to discuss this further.
My honourable friend is right that sustainable development must be at the heart of the planning system, and that's why we're committed to meeting the needs for housing by building the right homes in the right places and protecting the environmental assets that matter most. The National Planning Policy Framework is clear that we should be responsive to local circumstances. I know that the relevant local plan in my honourable friend's area is due for further consultation later this year, and that he'll engage with that process, but I will happily meet with him and colleagues to discuss his situation further.
Ed Davey.
Mr. Speaker, the abuse suffered by 88-year-old Anne King at the hands of staff in her care home was captured on a hidden camera. The footage is stomach-churning. Anne died in October 2022, and it took nearly a year before the CQC launched a criminal investigation. Now Anne's children are working to protect other care home residents from being subjected to such appalling abuse. Her son came to see me as his MP to ask for my help in their campaign. So will the Prime Minister join me in backing Anne's Law, a proposal to include a national register to professionalise the care workforce and hold those staff who are abusive to account? And will he meet with Anne's family and myself to discuss this idea?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I first of all extend my sympathies to Anne's family for what she went through. Obviously, that's not appropriate, and I'll make sure that the department engages with him and Anne's family on the proposed law. And he's right to say we should have high standards across the care industry, and we're walking towards more investment to support our care home staff, making sure that they have training, qualification, development, and we have a regime in place that can hold everyone to account for delivering the high standards that we would all expect.
Sarah Downs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that one of the greatest things that these backbenches bring to Westminster is plain old-fashioned common sense? And it's Derbyshire common sense. Derbyshire common sense that means that the good people of Ashbourne and surrounding villages reject the Sadiq Khan ULEZ rules and even the 20 miles an hour Welsh. Will he join with me and perhaps ask his neighbour if he will pay for the Ashbourne bypass?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know my honourable friend has been a dedicated campaigner for the Ashbourne bypass, and the government is committed to investing more in the Midlands, particularly investing every penny of the £9.6 billion from HS2 back into the local area. And she's right that we will focus on drivers and their priorities, not continue the war on motorists, which is waged by the Labour mayor in London, but also the Labour Party in Wales, with both ULEZ and 20 mile an hour speed limits. It's this party that is unashamedly on the side of the motorist.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Our Child of the North cross-party group found that expectant mothers were terminating wanted pregnancies as they could not afford another mouth to feed. Recent figures show infant and child death rates have increased in the most deprived areas, and 50 children have died alone in unregulated accommodation. Is this his plan for a brighter Britain in action?
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, obviously what the Honourable Lady has described is tragedy. Nobody wants to see children grow up in those circumstances, and that's why I'm proud that the government has overseen a significant fall in poverty, but particularly child poverty, since 2010 through a range of measures, and I'll make sure that she is aware for her constituents of all the support that is in place, both through the Department of Health and through the Department for Work and Pensions and local authorities, to provide support to the most vulnerable families in our communities.
John Penrose.
Mr. Speaker, Weston-super-Mare is a growing town, so local health services are rightly growing too. Weston Hospital is treating more patients for a wider variety of problems than before. GP surgeries are offering thousands more appointments this year than last, and our new diagnostic centre means faster tests and treatments. But there's a fly in our NHS prescribed ointment. Dentistry isn't fixed yet. The new dental recovery plan is very welcome, but when will it mean appointments that Westonians can book?
Mr. Speaker, our dentistry recovery plan will make dental services faster, simpler and fairer for patients, funding around 2.5 billion more appointments. And I was pleased to note that access is improving in my honourable friend's area, with almost 10% more children seeing a dentist in June last year than the previous year. But we are going further. The new patient premium that was announced last year is ensuring that more NHS dentistry will be provided. And since then, at the end of January, 500 more practices have said that they are now open to new patients.
Chris Law.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's now been over a month since the Parliamentary Ombudsman delivered a long-awaited report on pension injustices. Yet women born in the 1950s in my constituency of Dundee, and indeed every constituency in this House across these islands, are still waiting to hear if the UK Government will listen to these recommendations and deliver compensation. Mr. Speaker, I was proud to see the Scottish Parliament support a motion last week calling for compensation to be delivered without delay, but utterly dismayed to see members of the Conservative Party and the Labour Party abstain. So can the Prime Minister finally set out when WSPI women will receive the compensation they rightly deserve?
Mr. Speaker, I understand the strong feelings across the chamber on this topic and the desire for urgency in addressing them. However, following the Ombudsman's 5-year investigation, it is imperative that we take the time to thoroughly review the comprehensive findings that have been published. An update to the House will be provided once the report's findings have been fully considered. More broadly, we are committed to ensuring pensioners have the dignity and security in retirement that they deserve, and most recently increasing the state pension by £900 thanks to the triple lock.
Sir Philip Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Is the Prime Minister as appalled as I am at reports of militant civil servant, trade union, political activists seeking to find ways not to implement the Rwanda deportations? Does he agree with me that if they are not prepared to implement the will of the government, an Act of Parliament that was passed by both Houses of Parliament, that they should conclude that being in the civil service is perhaps not for them, and maybe they can look for alternative employment at other left-wing organisations that masquerade as being impartial? Maybe they could try the BBC or Channel 4 News.
Mr. Speaker, my expectation is that civil servants will continue to be committed to supporting our priority of stopping the boats and deliver in accordance with the Civil Service Code. He'll know that we made specific changes to ensure compliance with that code as we push through with our plans. But I agree with him more broadly that we are the only party that has a plan to stop the boats, and we will face down all the obstacles in our way to deliver on this crucial priority for the British people. And whoever stands in our way, whether it's the Labour Party or others, we will deliver for this country on this vital issue.
Malcolm McDonald.
Mr. Speaker, China has now hacked the data of defence personnel, the Electoral Commission, various other public institutions, and has targeted many members of this House. And yet plans by China's largest wind turbine manufacturer, Mingyang Smart Energy, to build its largest European facility right here in the UK advance at pace, with the facility set to be built in Scotland. Given widely shared concerns about the involvement of hostile states such as China in the UK's critical national energy infrastructure, does he not agree that now is the time for this project to be paused, to be reviewed by the government on national security grounds? And if not, what message does he think that sends?
Well, as I've said repeatedly, China is a country with different values to ours and is acting in a way that is increasingly authoritarian at home and assertive abroad. It's right that we take firm steps to protect ourselves against that, particularly in the area of economic security, which is why this government passed the National Security and Investment Act, precisely so that we can screen transactions without commenting on individual ones, of course, to protect this country. And we have used those powers, not least to block Chinese investment in a sensitive semiconductor company, but also to ensure that the Chinese state nuclear company had no part in the future of our nuclear power. So he can rest assured that we're alive to the challenges and have passed laws that give us the powers to protect against them.
Charlize Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 5-year-old Benedict Blythe was a lovely little boy who attended a primary school in my constituency. Sadly, however, he died of anaphylaxis, a severe allergic reaction. The coroner's inquest has not yet reported, but speaking generally, on average, 2 children in every class have a food allergy, and allergic reactions take place more in school than in any other setting outside the home. Severe allergic reactions are on the rise and can be fatal. Yet there is no explicit legal requirement for schools to have allergy medication, an allergy policy, or other recommended safeguards being made available. There is only guidance. Will the Prime Minister meet with me and Benedict's parents, Helen and Pete, so that we can discuss a way forward to ensure that children who suffer from allergies in schools can be more safe, including schools having an allergy policy, adrenaline pens, and staff who know how to use them?
Well, firstly, can I extend my sympathy to Benedict's family? It's tragic always to hear about the loss of a child, and we fully understand the seriousness of severe allergies and believe that children with medical conditions should be properly supported to enjoy a full education and be safe at school. Now, there is a legal duty on the governing body of schools to make arrangements for supporting pupils, including setting out what needs to be done, symptoms, treatment, but I will ensure that my right honourable friend gets a meeting with the Health Secretary to discuss how we could further support pupils with serious allergies.
On Speller.
Yesterday, his Chancellor confirmed that it's government policy to abolish national insurance, a £46 billion annual cost, and no indication of where the money's coming from. So can the Prime Minister rule out further freezes on tax allowances or an 8p increase in income tax to pay for it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's total nonsense, and of course I rule that out. And let me just close up. Mr. Speaker, there is no unfunded policy. What we have said is that we have a long-term ambition to keep cutting national insurance to end the unfairness of the double taxation on work. We'll make progress towards that goal in the next Parliament, just as we already have in this, by cutting national insurance by 1/3 in 6 months, delivering a £900 tax cut, at the same time is increasing investment in the NHS and increasing the state pension. But it's increasingly clear what this reveals is that the Labour Party opposes tax cuts for working people.
Angela Richardson.
Thank you. Empowering local pharmacies is a key part of this government's plan to cut waiting lists. In Guildford, we recently lost 2 neighbouring pharmacies. But good news, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to report that by working diligently with local pharmacists, concerned residents, the Minister and the ICB, I have helped to secure a new pharmacy in Burford. Yeah. Will my right honourable friend join me in welcoming this new pharmacy, and does he agree that it is vital residents should have access to a good, efficient and, above all, local pharmacy? Yeah.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I care deeply about the future of our community pharmacies. I'm very pleased to hear about my honourable friend's success in securing a new pharmacy for her constituents, joining the 10,500 others across the country. And she's now right about the important role that our local pharmacies can play. That's why we're backing them with £645 million of additional funding through Pharmacy First, so that you can now go straight to your pharmacist, receive treatment for 7 of the most common ailments, saving you time and ensuring that patients get the care they need quicker and closer to home.
Mr. Speaker, last Friday, The Guardian reported major structural deficiencies at Stepping Hill Hospital in Stockport. Stepping Hill's major outpatients building, the radiology department and the critical care unit have all been condemned. In March, I met with senior officials at Stockport NHS Trust. They were very clear that a sustained lack of capital investment is the root cause of problems at my local hospital. Mr. Speaker, does the Prime Minister believe that our hospitals, quite literally crumbling, is the price worth paying for the 14 years of successive Conservative failure?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we fully recognise the need to invest in health infrastructure across the country, including at Stepping Hill Hospital, and that's why we are currently spending around £4 billion a year for Trust to spend on necessary maintenance and repairs, on top of the £20 billion new hospital programme and the additional funding that was put aside to deal with RAC maintenance. But he talks about a legacy of the NHS. All he needs to do is look at his party's record in Wales, where people currently are experiencing the worst A&E performance and the longest wait times anywhere in Great Britain.
Ruth Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Nottingham City Council is expecting to fall short of its housing target by 6,000 new homes. Last time this happened, Rushcliffe, as a neighbouring authority, was forced to take thousands of homes on top of its own housing target, which led to huge pressures on our green spaces and public services. So can my right honourable friend reassure me and my constituents that the changes we've made to the planning system will mean that this time we will be protected from Labour's failure in Nottingham?
Well, my honourable friend makes an important point, and while on this side of the House, the Conservatives believe in building the right homes in the right places, with local people having a say, all Labour would do is impose top-down housing targets on areas, decimating our precious countryside. And in Nottinghamshire, as she says, you can see the difference, Mr. Speaker, between the well-run Conservative County Council compared to the bankrupt Nottingham Council, which has left residents to pick up the bill from their profligacy.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Untreated sewage was pumped into English waterways for more than 3.6 million hours last year, and into the sea off Sussex beaches 3 times in the last 24 hours alone. Yet since privatisation, the water companies have been allowed to rack up debts of over £64 billion and their shareholders to pocket £78 billion in dividends. The majority of the public, including 58% of Conservative and 80% of Labour supporters, want to turf out the profiteering polluters. They want water brought back into public hands. When is he going to listen to them and end the legalised scam of privatisation?
Well, Mr. Speaker, our plans to tackle this have gone further than any other previous government. In fact, we now monitor 100% of overflows, up from just 7% under the Labour Party. We're investing a record £56 billion into our water infrastructure, and we've enshrined in law strict targets and introduced unlimited fines for water companies, holding them and their bosses to account. So it's crystal clear that the record shows that there's only one party who has a clear plan to tackle this issue for the environment, and it's the Conservative Party.
Final question, Matt Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Everybody knows that Stockton is a great place with great people and a great football team. My right honourable friend recently visited the mighty Stockton town to see the incredible work that they do in the local community and heard about their promotion battle. I'm sure he'll want to join me in congratulating Mickey Dunwell and the mighty Anchors on their promotion.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it was fantastic to visit Stockton Town FC with my honourable friend, who is a brilliant champion for his local community, which I see firsthand on a weekly basis. And let me join him in congratulating everyone at the club on their well-deserved promotion, and I hope some of their good luck rubs off on Southampton in the coming weeks.
Very brief. That completes Prime Minister's questions.
Well, it does complete Prime Minister's questions. A rare bright spot there, talking about Southampton Football Club for the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. But before we get into the drama at the beginning of Prime Minister's questions, let's introduce our guests for this part of Politics Live. For the government, Laura Farris, Home Office Minister, Annalise Dodds, the Labour Party Chair, and Vicki Young, the BBC's Deputy Political Editor. Well, if Rishi Sunak thought it was going to be an uncomfortable and difficult Prime Minister's question session for him following those local election results, the drubbing that the Conservative Party had and the results of the mayoral elections, when Keir Starmer stood up to welcome the new Labour MP for Blackpool South, who of course won that by-election with a pretty stunning swing to the Labour Party, he also said, to the surprise of most people in the chamber and certainly here, that he was also welcoming the new Labour MP, Natalie Elphicke, the former Conservative MP for Dover. Another defection from Tories to Labour, just as Prime Minister's questions was beginning, Vicki.
Yeah, I mean, you normally get a hint of this before Prime Minister's questions. I mean, a party would like to surprise a Prime Minister, but this was, I don't think I've ever seen it quite like this, where no one knew it was going to happen, and suddenly there's Natalie Elphicke, the MP for Dover, sitting behind Sir Keir Starmer, having just defected. Now, of course, she's not a minister, she's not a particular high-profile MP, but it's always the words that go with the defection that are the problem. And again, that is the issue here. She has been incredibly critical, saying the Conservatives have become a byword for incompetence and division. It's a tired and chaotic government. She's particularly exercised about immigration. She's, of course, the Dover MP, about housing, borders, and about the failure to build homes. So yet more ammunition there for Labour. Natalie Elphicke, we understand, is actually going to stand down at the next election. She's not going to carry on fighting. There is a Labour candidate in place there who's a former soldier, so he will continue to fight that seat. But yes, another blow for the Prime Minister. As you say, just as his position, if you like, is safer because those critical Tory MPs have said they're not going to try and oust him, another blow for him.
Right, it is a huge blow. I mean, basically, Tory MPs are leaving a sinking ship. That is what this demonstrates, doesn't it, Laura?
Well, I'm going to refute that, Jo. And you know, obviously, it's not. It comes as a shock at the beginning of PMQs when that happens. I mean, one of the things that I find entirely incoherent about this defection is what Natalie has done and said in the past. She was very, very vocal in her support of the Illegal Migration Act and the Safety of Rwanda Bill. She wrote an article just months ago saying that Labour had no plan on immigration, that their strategy was dangerous. Her words in the Express, she talked about how it was a charter, that their plan was a charter for letting terrorists in. Now, that's not my words, that's her words. And now, apparently, she wishes to convince the people of Dover that that is the right approach for them. And I'm afraid I think that is really disappointing.
But
that's
what,
not a
but
personal
what do you
criticism.
say? But what do you say? Yeah, well, hang on. I take all that and I'll put that to Annalise. But taking all that into account, this is a Conservative MP broadly on the right of the party. It follows a week or so after another defection from the Conservatives to the Labour Party, Dr Dan Poulter, on a different wing of the party on the NHS. He made similar criticisms about Labour's strategy on the NHS. I put it to you again, Labour, if Tory MPs have had enough of Rishi Sunak and the Conservative government, and they're coming from all wings of the party, two wings of the party, talking about NHS, housing, Natalie Elphicke talked about, and the safety and security of our borders, which she knows something about as the Dover MP, then you failed.
Well, look, I don't accept we failed. I do, of course, understand that there were two defections. You know, the Health Secretary, Victoria Atkins, said that in the time that she'd been in post, Dan Poulter had never raised a single concern with her about the state of the health service. And the only thing he had done is invite her to go and speak at one of his fundraising dues. So sometimes it's hard for me to peer into the hearts of other people
but
and
Laura,
know whether they've got an axe to grind.
You're clutching a little bit at straws. The broad picture here is flight. Flight from a Conservative party that has just suffered a pretty dismal, disappointing set of election results where from top to bottom of the country, voters have said no more to the Conservatives. I mean, Keir Starmer's got a point when he says Labour is winning everywhere. How many more times does the Conservative Party need to reject him, or the voters, before he gets the hint?
Well, look, let me just say this. Of course, the local elections were a disappointing night. And of course, I answer that challenge with the degree of humility that I think any politician should show. I'd also add that I've never liked it. In 2021, I think we got our best local results since 2005 or something. I've never liked that you should sort of have your tail up and feel complacent. You are always on the back foot as a politician. You're always trying to persuade the public that you deserve their vote. Rishi Sunak we have been through some tough waters. Any government of any stripe would have struggled with COVID, would have struggled with the invasion of Ukraine, the energy spike. But we have a plan that we are delivering on.
Well, come on
the cost of living, on immigration, on the NHS.
Why don't Natalie Elphicke and Dan Poulter, who were Conservative MPs for quite a considerable amount of time, if they don't believe it, why should anyone else?
But the reality is I can't comment on what their personal reasons are. The fact they're both standing down, and I have to say, given all the remarks that Natalie's made in the past attacking Labour, I do find it incoherent. I do wonder, given she's so critical of Labour's immigration policy, how she squares it to people in Dover who she represents.
Let's put that
these,
to Annalise.
You know, dangerous policies are in their interest.
Well, look, let's show this headline. I think we might have flashed it up just before in the Daily Express. Don't trust Labour on immigration. They really want open borders, warns Natalie Elphicke, and this was only last year. The Labour Party will just take anyone, won't they?
Well, actually, Natalie Elphicke has looked closely at Labour's plan on these issues, and Labour has a plan. I'm afraid what we have from the Conservatives is the Rwanda scheme, which is a costly con. And Natalie clearly has looked at that. She's reflected that in her statement today, saying that she is deeply concerned about the fact that lives are being lost in the Channel, that we're not seeing that reduction in the boats. In fact, just last Wednesday, we saw twice as many people coming into the UK on boats than would even be covered by the Rwanda scheme, by the government's own reckoning. But, of course, she's also raising the issue of housing as well, as you mentioned.
But let's stick with Rwanda, because actually you say that she's looked at your plan. Well, that's encouraging. But literally a few months ago, she tweeted in January this year, so, you know, much more recently, Labour leaders' latest relaunch completely ignored the small boats crisis. She then lists the numbers and says another reminder, Labour have time and again opposed action to tackle the Channel crossings. She supported the Rwanda scheme. She doesn't or didn't support yours. What's changed her mind?
Well, I presume looking at what Labour's actually setting out and understanding that Labour has got that plan to smash the criminal gangs who are putting people in this appallingly dangerous position that she refers to in her statement, to actually get through that huge perma backlog, almost 100,000 people whose claims have not been processed, to deal with this issue, which is of concern to her constituents. And also Labour having that plan to deal with the other issues that she sets out, not least housing. And of course, as you mentioned, she's the second Conservative MP now in 2 weeks to take this action. And, you know, the big issue here is why Rishi Sunak is holding our country hostage. He's refusing to have that general election that people so clearly want. He should enable people to have their say. That's what's lying behind this.
I mean, what is the point of holding on, really, Laura? Because it's not just the two defections that we're talking about. We had Paul Scully, Conservative MP, sitting here saying he thinks Labour will win the election. Jacob Rees-Mogg, former Cabinet Minister, said the Tories are going to experience or suffer a thumping defeat unless they radically change direction. Why not just have that election now?
Well, I'm going to argue a slightly different case. I think Rishi Sunak has earned the right to deliver on his plan, and we're seeing progress. On the small boat, something that Natalie was very pleased about at one point is that last year we reduced the number coming across the Channel by 36%, at the same time as there were an additional 2 million coming across the Mediterranean into continental Europe. The purpose of the Rwanda plan is to create a complete deterrent so that the person, generally a young man standing on the beaches of northern France, thinks twice before they give 5-10 grand to get in one of those unbelievably dangerous dinghies and make that journey. And that we have instead the humane and rational and lawful asylum policy that's seen us take 500,000 people in the last 8 years from countries like Afghanistan and Ukraine and Hong Kong. And the other point that I would just gently make is that I know that Annalisa was talking about the backlog of 100,000, but I think Labour's policy is to grant an amnesty without even assessing those cases.
Well,
I'm sorry,
in
the interests of
can you clear that up for us, Annalise? Because we've got, I mean, obviously the Conservatives have put out a statement saying we wish Natalie well as she now has to support Labour's amnesty for illegal immigrants, and one that directly opposes her own views. What is Labour's policy on that?
Well, you know, I think it's really disappointing when there's an issue that's as serious as this, and when we have a governing party that is repeating what it knows are untruths. Labour's been absolutely clear. We will process those claims. That's not happening under the Conservatives. There's been a huge fall in the number of returns and in the number of people being processed. As I said, almost 100,000 people now, many of them staying in hotels, the cost of that being enormous. So there won't be an amnesty?
There will not be an amnesty under a Labour government for illegal immigrants? I mean, that may be the right policy, but there won't be.
No, there will not be, because we believe there needs to be an immigration system that is robust, that is fair, that is assessing people's claims, not leaving people in limbo in hotels for months, if not years in some people's cases. We need to have that robust system, and I'm afraid that's not being delivered by the Conservatives at the moment.
But we
they're
also
trying to obfuscate.
But we also don't know when Labour, if you win the general election, would actually scrap the Rwanda scheme.
Well, we would not continue with that scheme. We've been absolutely clear. It's a scheme that's almost
you haven't been clear about when it would go, because I've spoken to a number of Labour politicians and they say it could continue for a bit.
Well, actually, what we said is we would cancel that scheme. We would not continue with that scheme. Now, of course, you've got a situation
even if it's
right
working,
now,
even if it's effective,
well,
and even if it's resolved the flow of people across the English Channel.
A scheme that's covering 1% of people who are coming in is not a scheme that's working. I think we've seen that already very, very clearly in the fact that we've actually seen more people coming through the channel. We need to have a serious approach to this. That's what Yvette Cooper has set out. And I'm afraid the government's approach is just a costly con, and that perhaps is why they're making these wild claims that bear no relation to what Labour's actually set out.
Well, very briefly, but clearly the local elections demonstrated that the voters have had enough of Conservatives and this Conservative government. But let me just show you this headline, and this is released today. Prisoners to be released 70 days early to ease overcrowding. Now, it's based on an email seen by The Times. This is your area, Laura, reporting that from the 23rd of May, in a couple of weeks, you'll start releasing prisoners 70 days early. Can you confirm that?
There is an early release scheme, yes, and that's been in place for some time now.
Yeah, but is it going to be as much as 70 days early that you'll be releasing prisoners?
I think I understand that to be the case. I'm not 100% sure on the precise number of days, but just to be absolutely clear, nobody convicted of a sex offence, a terrorist offence, a serious violent offence, or sentenced for more than 4 years will be eligible. And it's the same programme that Labour had under Jack Straw between 2007 and 2010.
Well, let's stick
with
with
one
now.
exception. With one exception, we have something called a governor lock. So if the governor thinks that an offender designated for early release, and we're only talking days from the end of their sentence, is not suitable for that programme, they can block it. That was not the policy when Labour.
But this is to ease overcrowding in prisons,
So
isn't it? There is no other reason for it.
The reason why we have
You've
overcrowding,
allowed that to happen.
No, the reason we have allowed overcrowding, we have overcrowding, is because we have a high remand population, and that's people awaiting trial. Ordinarily, it's 9,000. At the moment, it's 16,000. The reason for that is that during COVID, we made the difficult decision to continue with full juries of 12 people. That was very difficult in a lockdown situation because we believe that that was the cornerstone of the right to a fair trial. That's an Article 6 right under the European Convention on Human Rights. Had we just gone with judge-only trials, some voices said we could have got the throughput through the courts. But at the moment, we have a high remand population. The other thing is, Jo, Public Health England told us that if we didn't release prisoners during COVID, thousands would die. We were told to release between 16 and 25,000
Laura, this hasn't just happened, has it,
No,
since
but-
COVID?
but-
I mean, there's been a build-up, hasn't there?
It is just about the remand population. It's 6,000 more people. That's nearly 10% of the prison population are on remand, and that is because of the courts.
You're the
and
victims
that's because
minister.
we continued with jury trials.
Are
And
you
I maintain that
letting
was the right thing to do.
victims down with policies like these as a result of overcrowding for the reasons that you have set out? But are you letting down victims?
Jo, I think we would have profoundly let the public down if we had let out dangerous offenders during COVID. In the end, we put public protection first. Less than 200 prisoners died. Every loss of life is a tragedy. But even so, that in France, they let out, I think, 11,000 people. In California alone, they let out 13,000 people, some of them the most high harm offenders who have reoffended in that time. We put public protection in that context ahead of public health, and we think we made the right call. And just before you go to Annalise, I'll just say one thing. The Labour Party have never said whether they think we were right or we were wrong not to mass release during COVID. They've never said whether they think we were right or we were wrong to continue with full juries of 12 people. But that's because actually they don't have an answer on this. They would have made the same choices.
Annalise, what would you do for tackling overcrowding?
But Laura, if this is something that is purely about what happened during COVID, why has your government increased the length of early release over recent months from first 18 days to then between 35 and 60 days to now 70 days? That's 10 weeks. Why has it gone up since the COVID period? This is clearly not just to do with the COVID period at all. Why has your government not spent the £4 billion that it allocated to build new prison spaces? I think it's, what, £1.3 billion worth of that has been spent. The rest of it hasn't. It's just yet another example of that incompetence that we've seen. And the impact of this is completely different from anything we've ever seen before, because it's combined with the instruction from the Justice Secretary of State that judges should bear prison overcrowding in mind when they're setting sentences.
That's not true.
And what that means is that you've got people, you can see these aren't serious offenders. Actually, you've got drug dealers, people who've been dealing drugs on our streets who are going to be let out early because of the government's failure to deliver the prison spaces that are needed.
What is the short-term answer? I mean,
So
the long-term
short-term
answer is
answer-
obviously more prison places and building more prisons, but that obviously takes a very long time. So,
well, it takes a long time for this government. We wouldn't be taking as long because we would be earmarking. We set out plans around doing this. In fact, we've been talking about this for a very long time when this problem first became apparent. We would be setting out ways of getting those spaces delivered as speedily as possible. To only have £1.3 billion of that £4 billion earmarked for extra spaces actually out of the door is absolutely ridiculous.
Are you in favour of scrapping short sentences altogether? Because the sentencing bill, which is the next big row that's coming up, but I don't know what's happened to that. Maybe you can tell us what's happened to the sentencing bill. But aren't there plans there to scrap short sentences?
The 12 months or less for certain categories of offence, just because we know the recidivism rate is actually much lower, where the individual has, yes, the sword of Damocles hanging over their heads, they've got an electronic tag, a curfew, controls on their behaviour, but if they can remain in their community, we know with the lower level offenders, they do less well in prison and they're less likely to reoffend. But just to say, we are in the middle of the biggest prison building exercise since the Victorian era. Two of them are already open.
years.
Fossway and Five Wells are open. Milk site
Isn't
next
that an
year.
admission?
HMP
Isn't that an
Grendon.
admission that you should have done this before?
Well, one of the issues we had, Vicky, was around planning permission for sites like Grendon, and it took longer than we had anticipated. But we are in the middle of creating 20,000 new places. So, yes, we have a short-term problem, but we are on the way to resolving that.
Let's return to the sort of party prospects, because one of the complaints when we were doing the local elections programme on Friday that we heard from councils is that people aren't listening, and these are former councillors for the Conservative Party. People aren't listening to the government anymore. They may like the message, they may not, but even if they do, they're just not listening. Suella Braverman, the former Home Secretary, has said at the weekend that the Conservatives will be lucky to have any MPs after the election. It is, and pretty apocalyptic. The Prime Minister says things are much closer. Voters will be watching and thinking, well, hang on, those are two very, very different views of what will happen at the election.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think as the Prime Minister, he's obviously clinging to anything that he can find. Now, not many Tory MPs do privately say that things are closer. I mean, there's only going to be one MP for Harlow, which was the council that they kept talking about, didn't they, in this studio. I think it's hopefully something will come up. They just hope that things will start to improve a little bit. And there is, of course, a difference between voting at a general election and voting in the local elections. And, that shouldn't be underestimated. The sort of most positive Tory MPs can be in private, really, is to say, look, maybe once we get to a general election campaign and people are choosing their Prime Minister, they will feel slightly different about this. But, it feels like damage limitation, and there aren't many Tory MPs who feel like they're going to be winning the general election.
I mean, morale is key when it comes to party politics. What do you think the defection of Natalie Elphicke has done today to morale within the Conservative Parliamentary Party?
It's another kick, isn't it? And you could see they probably all came into Prime Minister's questions thinking, right, we can get behind the Prime Minister here, and then just immediately, the second before it starts, they're presumably sitting there thinking, what's she doing over there? And it is just one thing after another, and I think it does feel at the time of John Major, towards the end of his time as Prime Minister, I would imagine Rishi Sunak wakes up every morning thinking, what on earth is going to happen today? Every time he tries to get onto the front foot. And that is the difficulty, particularly if he's not setting out, maybe in strong enough terms, a vision for what he wants to do. What does he want to do with the next 5 years if he's going to be Prime Minister and wants to be Prime Minister for the next 5 years? I think that's where quite a lot of frustration is amongst Tory MPs.
Right, I mean, the vision is difficult, isn't it? I can't get two Tory MPs to agree on a vision. They have different ideas about how to save, if you like, Rishi Sunak. It does feel a little bit like the end of John Major's time as Prime Minister, death by 1,000 cuts. Is that how it feels to you?
Well, I mean, I don't know whether I'm sort of in a, vacuum, but I feel like we're, you know, both in my constituency and in my department, we're working really hard. We've got things in progress, legislation, the Criminal Justice Bill coming back before the House. I understand that there's sort of an attractive narrative that it's all over and it's all a done deal. But I actually, as I say, and I said at the top of the show, I don't think politics is ever a settled matter. Do you remember in 2019 in the European elections, I think the Tories were on 9%. I don't think you ever are complacent in one direction or the other. I think it's incumbent upon you as an MP to slave away for your constituents, to continue making the case for your party. I'm very supportive of the Prime Minister. I do think he has a vision and I do think he deserves the next few months to execute it.
But Laura, you just reflected this again. Earlier in the programme, you said that Rishi Sunak had the right to govern. Now, nobody has the right to govern unless they're focused on our country's needs and they're actually delivering for our country on the issues that they care about. And that's the big frustration here, because for as long as he remains in post and refuses to allow people to have that say at a general election, he is holding our country back. You know, we see that right across the piece. Cost of living, house building, public services, our country's security and defence, in all of those areas we are not moving forward because the Conservative Party just can't deliver.
And the problem is, these are all issues you're going to have to deal with if you win that election. And when it comes to issues like the economy, people can't see clear enough difference between the two of you. You'll be inheriting all this.
Well, we've set out very clear plans to make sure that we get Britain building again, everything from a radical revolution, really, in our planning rules, through to sovereign wealth funds, through to an industrial strategy, which we've never had, through to a new deal for working people. We believe that we can deliver those measures if we're given that chance to serve, and we can turn our economy and our country around.
All right, it's all we have time for now. Thank you to all of my guests for joining for this part of Politics Live. And Prime Minister's questions, yes, delivered that surprising and rather dramatic news of another defection from the Conservative Party to Labour. The Dover MP, Natalie Elphicke, will sit as a Labour MP until the general election, whenever that's called. From all of us here, we'll discuss more of this tomorrow. Bye-bye.